Wyatt Blackwood's calloused hands trembled as he signed the mail-order bride contract. Aware of the snickering faces pressed against the window of Silver Creek's only post office on that sweltering August afternoon in 1878. The 28-year-old rancher had spent 6 years building his homestead alone, and loneliness had finally broken his stubborn resolve. "Well, I'll be damned," drawled Hank Peterson, the town's self-appointed gossip pushing through the door. Wyatt Blackwood finally admitting he can't catch himself a woman the natural way. Wyatt folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his vest pocket. "I reckon a man knows what he needs, Hank. You read the fine print, Cowboy?" Hank's weathered face cracked into a grin. "Says right there she's mute, silent as a church mouse. Desperate times call for desperate measures, I suppose." More laughter bubbled through the growing crowd. Wyatt kept his eyes forward, tipping his hat to Mabel Jenkins behind the counter. "Much obliged, madam." The whispers followed him down Main Street as he mounted his chestnut mare. "Blackwood so insufferable even a woman with a voice wouldn't have him," someone called out, followed by howls of laughter. Wyatt spurred his horse toward home, the 5-mile ride giving him plenty of time to wonder if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. 2 weeks later, he stood anxiously at the Silver Creek station as the afternoon train belched black smoke into the clear Colorado sky. A small crowd had gathered, not to welcome new arrivals but to witness Wyatt Blackwood's silent bride. She descended from the passenger car clutching a small carpetbag, her chestnut hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet. She was younger than Wyatt had expected, perhaps 20 or 21, with wide, intelligent eyes that surveyed her surroundings warily. "Miss Nora O'Sullivan?" Wyatt asked, removing his hat. She nodded, her gaze direct and unafraid. "I'm Wyatt Blackwood." He extended his hand awkwardly, then withdrew it, unsure of the proper etiquette. "Welcome to Silver Creek." Behind him, someone snickered. First conversation of their marriage and likely the last. Wyatt's neck burned with embarrassment, but Nora seemed unfazed. She opened her carpetbag and withdrew a small slate and chalk, quickly writing in a neat, flowing script. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Blackwood." "Let me take your bag," he offered, surprised by the formality of her writing. As they walked toward his wagon, the whispers and laughter grew louder. Nora kept her head high, though Wyatt noticed her fingers tightening around her slate. Hank Peterson stepped directly into their path. My, Blackwood, she's a pretty little thing. Shame she can't tell you when you're boring her to tears." Before Wyatt could respond, Nora scribbled furiously on her slate and held it up for Hank to see. "And a shame you can speak when you have nothing worth saying." The crowd fell momentarily silent before erupting in surprised laughter. Hank's face reddened as Wyatt guided Nora past him to the waiting wagon. As they left town, Wyatt cleared his throat. "I should tell you about the ranch. It's not much yet, but I've got 60 acres, 30 head of cattle, and a decent house. 2 bedrooms, he added awkwardly. "You'll have your own room, of course, unless." Nora wrote quickly, "I understand the arrangement, Mr. Blackwood." "Wyatt, please." She nodded, then wrote, "I can cook, clean, and sew. I was a school teacher before." "A school teacher?" Wyatt was surprised. "What happened?" Her face darkened, and she tucked the slate away, turning to watch the landscape instead of answering. Wyatt didn't press further. The remainder of the hour-long journey passed in silence, though it wasn't as uncomfortable as he'd feared. The late afternoon sun painted the rolling grasslands gold, and twice Nora tapped his arm to point out deer grazing in the distance. When his homestead came into view, a sturdy 2-room cabin with a newly added bedroom wing. A barn, corral, and sprawling pasture island, Nora's eyes widened. She pulled out her slate. "It's beautiful." Pride swelled in Wyatt's chest. "Been working it 6 years now, started with nothing but that 1-room cabin and 4 scraggly cattle." Nora wrote, "You've accomplished much." "I aim to accomplish more," he replied, helping her down from the wagon. "Come on, I'll show you around." The house was simple but clean. Wyatt had spent the past week scrubbing every surface, arranging wildflowers in a tin can on the table, and installing a proper cookstove he'd ordered from Denver. "Your room," he said, showing her the small but bright bedroom he'd added on. A patchwork quilt covered the bed and curtains made from flour sacks framed the window. "It's not fancy," but Nora touched his arm, stopping his apology. She wrote, "It's perfect, thank you." That night, Wyatt made a simple supper of beans and cornbread, insisting that Nora rest after her journey. They ate in surprisingly comfortable silence, Wyatt occasionally commenting on ranch business or local happenings. As they finished eating, Nora wrote, "Tomorrow I'll take over the cooking." "No rush," Wyatt replied. "Get settled first." She shook her head and wrote, "I want to earn my keep." Wyatt frowned. "This isn't. You're not a servant, Nora. This is a marriage, or it will be when we get to know each other better." Her expression was unreadable as she wrote. The contract was clear. "I provide domestic services in exchange for security and respectability. Love isn't necessary." "Maybe not necessary," Wyatt said quietly, "but it would be nice, wouldn't it? Someday." Nora didn't respond, simply gathering the dishes and moving to wash them despite Wyatt's protests. Later, bidding her goodnight at her bedroom door, Wyatt said, "I know this isn't ideal. I know you probably had different dreams, but I promise to be a good husband, Nora. I'll never hurt you or force you to. Well, anything. We have time." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once before closing her door. Wyatt lay awake that night, wondering about the woman sleeping under his roof. What had brought a schoolteacher to become a mail-order bride? Why couldn't she speak? And would she ever look at him with something other than cautious politeness? The following weeks established a routine. Nora proved to be an excellent cook and housekeeper. She transformed the cabin with small touches, wildflowers arranged in bottles, curtains sewn from fabric purchased on their weekly trips to town, shelves organized with precise care. Wyatt found himself looking forward to returning from his long days working the ranch. Sometimes he'd bring her small gifts: a pretty rock, a bird's feather, once a kitten he'd rescued from a hollow log. Each gift earned him a smile that seemed incrementally warmer than the last. Their communication developed its own rhythm. Nora carried her slate constantly, but they also created informal signs for common things: coffee, thank you, good morning. Wyatt began teaching her about ranching, and she proved a quick study, soon helping with the chickens and vegetable garden. They had been married for nearly a month, though only on paper, as Wyatt had kept his promise not to rush her when they made their usual Saturday trip to town for supplies. "Well, if it isn't the silent bride and her besotted cowboy," called Hank Peterson from outside the general store. "Tell me, Blackwood, don't you miss a woman's sweet voice, or have you trained her to make animal sounds yet?" Several bystanders laughed. Wyatt felt Nora stiffen beside him. "That's enough, Peterson," Wyatt said, his voice dangerously low. "Aw, I'm just having fun," Hank continued. "But seriously, it must be convenient having a wife who can't nag. What you do to deserve such luck?" Something snapped in Wyatt. Before he realized what was happening, he had Hank by the collar. "My wife deserves your respect. She's twice the person you'll ever be." Hank pushed him away. "Defending her honor, that's rich. Everyone knows you only bought her because no real woman would have you." Wyatt's fist connected with Hank's jaw before he could think better of it. The older man stumbled backward, then lunged. Soon they were scuffling in the dirt, townspeople gathering to watch. Suddenly, Wyatt felt Nora's small hands pulling at his arm. He looked up to see her face twisted with concern, her slate held up. "Please stop, not worth it." Shame flooded him as he stood brushing dust from his clothes. "I'm sorry," he said to her, ignoring Hank's curses. "Let's get our supplies and go home." The ride back to the ranch was tense. Once home, Wyatt busied himself with the horses while Nora went inside. When he finally entered the house, she was waiting with her slate. "Thank you for defending me, but please don't fight again." "I lost my temper," he admitted. "It makes me furious how they talk about you," she wrote. "I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be," he said fiercely. Then, more gently, "Nora, I realize I never asked. Would you like to tell me what happened, how you lost your voice?" For a long moment he thought she might refuse. Then she began to write, filling the slate, erasing and writing more. Her story emerged slowly. She had been teaching at a small school in Boston when a fire broke out. She had saved several children, returning repeatedly to the burning building. The smoke damage to her throat had been permanent. Her fiancé had broken their engagement soon after, unwilling to marry a woman who couldn't speak. Unable to continue teaching due to prejudice from parents and unwelcome at home where her silence was considered a burden, she had answered Wyatt's advertisement out of desperation. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," Wyatt said when she finished, his voice thick with emotion. "Those children owe you their lives." Nora shook her head, writing, "I only did what anyone would do." "No," Wyatt insisted. "What you did was extraordinary, and that man who left you, he was a fool." She looked down, but not before Wyatt caught the sheen of tears in her eyes. Acting on impulse, he reached across the table and took her hand. "I want you to know something, Nora. I don't care that you can't speak. I care about who you are, and I'm starting to think I'm the luckiest man in Colorado." A small smile curved her lips as she squeezed his hand in return. That night marked a turning point. Though they still maintained separate bedrooms, the invisible wall between them began to crumble. Nora started joining Wyatt for ranch chores beyond the garden and chickens. He taught her to ride, delighting in her newfound freedom as she galloped across the prairie. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire. Wyatt read aloud from books they purchased on their town visits, while Nora worked on embroidery or mending. Sometimes they played checkers, Nora proving a formidable opponent who showed no mercy. One evening in late October, as the first chill of winter crept into the air, Wyatt noticed Nora looking unusually pensive. "Everything all right?" he asked. She hesitated, then wrote, "Tomorrow is my birthday." "I'll be 22. "Your birthday," Wyatt exclaimed. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? We should celebrate." She shrugged, writing, "I haven't celebrated in years." "Well, that changes tomorrow," Wyatt declared. "I have to ride out early to check the north pasture fence, but I'll be back by noon." "We'll make it special." The next morning, Wyatt left before dawn, but not to check fences. Instead, he rode hard for town, a list clutched in his hand. He returned by mid-morning, saddlebags bulging, to find Nora feeding the chickens. "Happy birthday," he called, dismounting with a grin. "I've got surprises, but you'll have to wait until this evening." Throughout the day, Wyatt was secretive, disappearing into the barn for hours at a time. When evening fell, he asked Nora to put on her best dress while he prepared. When she emerged from her room in her blue Sunday dress, hair loose around her shoulders, Wyatt's breath caught. "You look beautiful," he said simply. He led her outside where he'd transformed their humble porch. A table covered with a real cloth was set with their best dishes and candles. A small cake sat in the center, surrounded by packages wrapped in brown paper. "I'm not much of a baker," Wyatt admitted sheepishly, "but Mrs. Thompson at the boarding house helped me." Nora's eyes shimmered as she wrote, "This is too much." "It's not nearly enough," Wyatt replied. He served a special dinner he'd arranged with the hotel restaurant: roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread. After they ate, he presented her gifts: a journal with a leather cover, hair ribbons in various colors, a silver hair comb, and finally, a small wooden box. "I made this," he said nervously as she opened it. Inside was a delicate wooden carving of a horse, its details remarkably intricate. "I've been working on it for weeks, meant it for Christmas, but," he shrugged, "seemed right for today." Nora traced the carving with her fingertips, then looked up at him with such naked emotion that Wyatt felt his heart might burst. She wrote, "No one has ever been so kind to me." "It's not kindness," Wyatt said softly. "It's how people treat someone they care about." Later, as they stood to clear the table, Nora suddenly touched his arm. When he turned, she stepped closer and, rising on tiptoe, pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. Wyatt stood frozen, warmth spreading from that simple contact throughout his body. Nora's cheeks flushed as she stepped back, looking uncertain. "Thank you," he whispered, reaching up to touch the spot her lips had graced. That night, for the first time, Wyatt dreamed not of someday having a real marriage, but of a future filled with moments just like this one, quiet, perfect, and completely theirs. As November brought the first snows, life on the ranch grew cozier. They spent more time indoors, and Wyatt found himself talking more than he ever had in his life. He told Nora about growing up in Pennsylvania, losing his parents to influenza when he was 17, heading west with nothing but determination and his father's pocket watch. "I always wanted a family," he admitted one evening as they sat before the fire. "Seems silly for a man who spent most of his life alone, but I'd watch those families in town, fathers with their children on their shoulders, wives leaning into their husbands' arms, and I'd think, that's what I'm working for." Nora wrote, "It's not silly, it's human." "What about you?" he asked. "Did you dream of a family?" She nodded, writing, "I wanted children, to teach them, watch them grow." "You'd be a wonderful mother," Wyatt said softly. Their eyes met across the small space between their chairs, and something electric passed between them. That night, after they'd said goodnight and retired to their separate rooms, Wyatt lay awake thinking about the future. He was falling in love with his silent bride, perhaps had been since the moment she'd stood up to Hank Peterson with nothing but a slate and determination. But did she feel the same? Or was she simply making the best of her circumstances? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He sat up, surprised to find Nora standing in his doorway, a candle illuminating her face. "Everything all right?" he asked, suddenly conscious of his state of undress, grateful for the blanket covering him to the waist. She nodded, entering hesitantly. She set down her candle and slate, then wrote, "May I stay with you tonight, just to sleep beside you?" Wyatt's heart hammered against his ribs. "Are you sure?" She nodded again, more confidently. "Then yes," he said, lifting the blanket. "Please." Nora slipped into bed beside him, her body warm and small against his. Carefully, he wrapped an arm around her waist, and she nestled closer, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder as though it had been made for her. "Good night, Nora," he whispered into her hair. She took his hand and squeezed it 3 times in succession. Though she didn't write it out, Wyatt understood the message perfectly. "I love you," he squeezed back 4 times. "I love you, too." They fell asleep tangled together, and when Wyatt woke the next morning to find her still in his arms, he knew a contentment he'd never imagined possible. December brought heavy snows that isolated the ranch. They spent Christmas Eve making decorations from paper and string, hanging them around the cabin alongside pine boughs Wyatt had gathered. He gifted her a locket he'd ordered from Denver months earlier, while she presented him with a scarf she'd knitted in secret. That night, their relationship evolved from simple companionship to passionate love, Nora leading Wyatt with surprising boldness to their now shared bedroom. As they lay breathless afterward, Wyatt cradling her against his chest, he marveled at how complete his life had become. "I never thought I could be this happy," he confessed. "You've made this house a home, Nora. You've made my life whole." She kissed him deeply in response, her body communicating what her voice could not. January brought illness to Silver Creek. Influenza swept through the town, claiming 3 lives in the first week. When Wyatt and Nora made their monthly supply run, they found the streets nearly deserted. "We should head back," Wyatt said uneasily after they'd loaded their wagon. "Best not linger." But 3 days later, Nora woke burning with fever. Wyatt's fear was absolute as he tended her, remembering all too clearly his parents' rapid decline from the same disease. For 3 days, he barely slept, bathing her forehead with cool cloths, forcing water between her cracked lips, praying as he hadn't since childhood. On the 4th day, her fever broke. Wyatt wept with relief, holding her hand as she drifted into natural sleep, but his relief was short-lived. That night, his own body betrayed him, succumbing to the illness that had nearly taken his wife through fevered dreams. Wyatt was aware of Nora's constant presence. Her cool hands on his brow, the weight of blankets being adjusted, broth being spooned into his mouth. Once he thought he heard something humming, soft and melodic, near his ear, but that was impossible. The fever gripped him fiercely. At his worst moments, he was certain he would die. He tried to speak, to tell Nora how much he loved her, but words wouldn't form. On what might have been the third or fourth daytime had lost meaning, Wyatt opened his eyes to clarity for the first time. The cabin was dim, lit only by firelight. Nora sat beside the bed, her head bowed in what appeared to be prayer, her lips moving silently. "Nora," he croaked, his throat raw. She looked up, joy illuminating her exhausted face. She reached for her slate. "Your fever broke an hour ago. The doctor says you'll recover." "Doctor?" Wyatt was confused. "I rode to town," she wrote. "Brought him back." Wyatt was stunned. Nora had never ridden alone to town, much less in winter, much less during an epidemic. "You could have been hurt or gotten sicker." She shook her head firmly, writing, "I wasn't losing you." Tears filled Wyatt's eyes. "I love you so much," he whispered. Nora set down her slate and leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his in a gesture of profound intimacy. Her lips moved, and though no sound emerged, Wyatt could read the words. "I love you too." Recovery was slow. February passed in a blur of weakness and gradual healing. Nora became Wyatt's strength, helping him walk when his legs trembled, preparing broths and stews to rebuild his strength, reading to him when his eyes were too tired to focus. By early March, Wyatt was well enough to resume light chores. As they worked together in the barn one afternoon, he found himself watching Nora as she collected eggs, struck anew by her quiet grace. "I've been thinking," he said suddenly. "When I'm fully recovered, I'd like to take you to Denver, get away from Silver Creek for a while. Maybe see a real doctor about your voice." Nora stilled, then set down her basket to write. "My voice won't come back. 3 doctors in Boston confirmed it." "Maybe they were wrong," Wyatt persisted. "Medicine advances, and even if they weren't, I'd like to give you a proper honeymoon." "We never had one." She considered this, then nodded with a small smile. "I'd like that." They planned their trip for May, when the spring calving would be complete and the weather favorable for travel. As Wyatt's strength returned fully, they resumed their normal routine, though Wyatt noticed Nora seemed preoccupied at times, lost in thought. One evening in late April, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the plains crimson and gold, Nora suddenly took Wyatt's hand and placed it on her abdomen. His confusion lasted only seconds before understanding dawned. "Are you?" he whispered, afraid to hope. She nodded, her eyes shining. "A baby," Wyatt breathed. "Our baby." They spent the evening making plans, Wyatt's excitement bubbling over as he talked about converting the storage room into a nursery, teaching their child to ride, building a proper swing from the old oak tree behind the house. Nora wrote, "You'll be a wonderful father." "We'll be wonderful parents," Wyatt corrected, kissing her. "Our child will never lack for love." Their trip to Denver was postponed indefinitely, replaced by preparations for the baby. Wyatt built a cradle, working late into the night to surprise Nora with the finished piece. She, in turn, began sewing tiny garments, her face serene as she worked. They still made their weekly trips to town, though the reception had gradually changed. Many who had once mocked them now regarded them with grudging respect. Wyatt's devotion to his silent wife had become something of a local legend, especially after Nora had braved the winter storm to fetch the doctor during his illness. Only Hank Peterson remained overtly hostile, though his taunts had grown more subdued after several prominent townspeople had taken him to task for his cruelty. It was during one such trip to town in early June that disaster struck. As they loaded supplies into their wagon, a commotion erupted down the street. A team of horses pulling a heavy freight wagon had spooked, breaking free from their handler. The wagon careened down the main street, directly toward where Nora stood. "Nora!" Wyatt shouted, lunging toward her. She turned, eyes widening at the approaching danger. Wyatt reached her just in time, shoving her roughly aside as the wagon thundered past, missing them both by inches. Shaken, they clung to each other in the middle of the street as townspeople rushed to secure the runaway horses. "Are you hurt?" Wyatt demanded, his hands frantically checking her for injuries. Nora shook her head, her face pale but determined as she pointed to her abdomen questioningly. "The baby's fine," Wyatt assured her, though his heart still raced with fear. "You're both fine." That night, Nora was unusually quiet, even for her. She wrote little, responding to Wyatt's conversation with nods or shakes of her head. As they prepared for bed, Wyatt finally addressed her withdrawn mood. "What's wrong, love? Are you sure you weren't hurt today?" She shook her head, then hesitantly reached for her slate. "Today made me realize how quickly I could lose everything." "But you didn't," Wyatt reminded her gently. "We're all safe." "But someday you might not be," she wrote, her hand trembling slightly. "And I wouldn't even be able to call for help, or tell our child how much I love them if something happened." Wyatt gathered her into his arms. "Your love comes through in everything you do, Nora. Our child will never doubt it for a moment." She buried her face against his chest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The following morning, Wyatt found Nora at the kitchen table before dawn, her slate covered in writing. She had been practicing making sounds, she explained. For months now, in private moments when Wyatt was out working the ranch. A doctor in Boston had once told her that while normal speech might be impossible, she might someday manage simple sounds with extensive practice. "I want to try," she wrote. "For our child, for you." "Only if you want to," Wyatt said carefully. "I don't need you to speak to know how you feel." But Nora was determined. Each day she practiced while Wyatt worked, and sometimes in the evenings he would hear her from the barn strained sounds that gradually became more deliberate. Summer passed into early autumn. Nora's pregnancy progressed healthily, her body changing as their child grew within her. Wyatt had never found her more beautiful and told her so daily. They were sitting on their porch one September evening, watching the stars emerge, when Nora suddenly straightened in her chair. She turned to Wyatt with an expression of such intensity that he was momentarily alarmed. "What is it?" he asked. "Is it the baby?" She shook her head, then took a deep breath. Her lips moved, forming a shape he recognized his name. But this time something else happened. A sound emerged, rough and halting but unmistakable. Wyatt. The word hung in the air between them, imperfect but miraculous. Tears spilled down Nora's cheeks as Wyatt stared at her in astonishment. "Say it again," he whispered, his own eyes filling. "Wyatt." Stronger this time, though still raspy and broken. A sob escaped him as he fell to his knees before her chair, gathering her hands in his. "You said my name," he choked out. "After all this time, you said my name." Nora nodded, her face radiant through her tears. "I love you," Wyatt said fiercely. "I have loved you from the moment you stood up to Hank Peterson with that slate of yours. I loved you before I knew your courage, your kindness, your strength, and I will love you until my last breath." Nora leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. Her lips moved again, and though the words were silent, Wyatt understood them perfectly. "You are my voice, you are my heart." 4 months later, on a crisp January morning, their daughter was born. They named her Hope, a testament to what had brought them together and sustained them through every challenge. And when Wyatt placed their tiny daughter in Nora's arms for the first time, she looked up at him with eyes full of joy and whispered, "Our family." The words imperfect but clear enough to send tears streaming down Wyatt's weathered cheeks. The town that had once laughed at the cowboy who bought a silent bride now watched with grudging admiration as that same cowboy walked proudly down Main Street, his arm supporting his wife as she carried their infant daughter. And if they noticed how his eyes glistened whenever she spoke his name in her halting voice, or how tenderly he steadied her when she stumbled over words, they kept their observations to themselves. For the love between Wyatt and Nora Blackwood had become something of a legend in Silver Creek, a reminder that sometimes the most profound communications need no words at all, and that a heart's language transcends all barriers.